Hail and well met Slayers of Giants. I thought I would be airing an interview this week, and I was excited about that because it went really well, but since then I've received word about a temporary gag order that I'm not a defendant in, but I've been advised to attempt to abide by just to avoid another excuse to prolong the situation. But guess what? Some people forget it's a bad idea to mess with a writer. We're hard to silence. I can abide by the injunction and still tell you a story, and you can decide for yourself what it means. So I'm going to continue to share from the serial novel I've been writing and posting since January. This particular project allows me to share a lot because of the premise. For those of you who are just jumping in now, this novel, working title Tilting at Windmills, just like the show, is told by an omniscient third-person narrator telling the story of a writer named Benjamin. At first I was worried that was too clever by half, maybe a little too cutesy, but now I'm really glad to have this venue because the narrator can tell you about what's been going on in this fictional Benjamin's life, and you can decide how much that connects to the universe you live in. This character is clearly fictional because in the universe of the story, he starts off so beaten down by the situation in which he finds himself that he effectively breaks with reality and invents a hallucination. Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi, a knight-errant and warrior mage who's a modern analog of Cervantes' Don Quixote. Only unlike Don Quixote, who's crazy, Rolando is sane and correct about living in a world of hidden magic, and we are all crazy for not being able to see the forces at work all around us. Again, I might be threatened for talking about some of those forces, but Lord Rolando and his former squire, now knight-in-training Sir Sanchez of the town of Eels, can confront those forces even if some people are trying to menace me out of identifying them by name. I don't have to. You're smart. So those of you just joining us, thank you for being here. If you want to more fully understand this chapter and the character Benjamin, go back to chapter 1. But I've tried to write this chapter in such a way that it will make sense as an entry point. Those earlier chapters are all available on my Substack and Patreon in video, audio, and text form, and they're available to free subscribers, so donate whatever you feel comfortable with. Because unlike some people, I don't ever want to put anyone in the poorhouse. And before I begin, thank you so much for your support of late. It has meant so much. Thanks to the subscribers to my Substack and Patreon, the people who've left encouraging comments and helped spread the word about my circumstances, and the folks who've purchased books and merch from the NotAPipePublishing store. Links in show notes. Your support has meant so much to me in a very difficult time. So here we go. Tilting at Windmills, Chapter 20. The Evil Wizard Fenkam Revealed. For a brief time, Benjamin felt a cautious hope. He called up his brother. I know I'm bad at telling people when things aren't going well for me, he confessed. I pretend everything's fine, and then people feel blindsided when they learn the truth. I need to work on that. But I have good news for a change, and I need to tell somebody. His brother had been off work for only a few minutes and had been interrupted mid-commute by the call. Okay? Benjamin tried to quickly summarize the situation with the current lawsuit he and his wife, Chris, were embroiled in against Megacorp, the company who had taken Chris's business and was, by their own admission, trying to bury the couple in legal expenses rather than admit wrongdoing. It had taken Benjamin and Chris a year to find an attorney in the same state as Megacorp's headquarters, just so they could fight back. Then they'd finally had a meeting with the company's CEO, and in that meeting, they'd tried to make it clear they were aware of a documentary film which would be coming out, one they were not a party to beyond a brief interview Chris did with the filmmaker, but which would probably embarrass the company, and they wanted to reach a settlement before the documentary's launch. They would later learn the CEO took this as a threat, rather than a warning, and only hardened his position. Benjamin came out of the meeting still holding on to a sliver of hope that the people involved were not consciously nefarious, but had been misinformed by one another, felt defensive about being shown to be incorrect about a number of issues, and were trying to protect their own egos. He hoped they would eventually calm down, and, on the advice of dispassionate counsel, would choose to negotiate a mutually beneficial settlement and make Chris and Benjamin whole after the improper removal of their business and life savings. Benjamin had learned there were specific legal terms for the improper seizure, like conversion, but he still conceived of it in the vernacular as theft, though he couldn't say so about Megacorp publicly, or they would certainly add any technicality to their list of ways they'd been wronged by the people whose livelihoods they'd taken away. And yet, things were suddenly looking up. The documentary Chris and Benjamin had been warned about finally appeared online. Benjamin had been nervous it might paint them in a questionable or confusing light, since they weren't really its focus, but it turned out to be accurate and clear enough about their limited role in the experience of the documentary's main protagonist. The documentary exploded in popularity online, gaining attention to Megacorp's behavior and generating a great deal of public outrage. Of course, some people reacted to that outrage in unfortunate ways, directing their hatred at innocent employees, insulting Chris for her appearance and sexual identity, mistaking her for another participant in the whole saga, and criticizing Benjamin for his outspoken anti-fascist politics. All of that was somewhat predictable and unavoidable. Some people are always awful online, and it was impossible to garner a great deal of attention without getting on the radar of those who would react in terrible ways. Still, most of the response was incredibly heartening. Benjamin went from curled up in a ball in bed believing his inclination to be hopeful was a character flaw, to, only a week later, feeling like things might actually work out. Chris waited a bit until the main protagonist of the documentary had received some support for his crowdfunding efforts, then started her own to try to request funds for the couple's legal defense. Benjamin initially felt she'd jumped the gun, and they should wait until their case was further along, but she turned out to be right. They made a video explaining their circumstances and showing irrefutable clips of Megacorp's admission of their strategy to destroy the couple, and people responded, chipping in small donations which ticked up so rapidly Benjamin watched as they crossed over the amount they already owed their lawyer and started to make a tiny dent in what they would owe as the fight went on. "I'm trying not to get too hopeful," he told his brother. "The rug has been pulled out from under us so many times. Lucy's football, you know. But I feel like this really might get them to the table to negotiate a settlement." His brother, his voice always lower than Benjamin's but now deepened by caution, simply said, "Yeah, I guess we'll see." And the caution was warranted. The next day, the CEO of Megacorp hopped onto a live stream to announce that the company wouldn't be litigating the issue in public, then proceeded to litigate in public about the ways the company felt attacked by all the bad press. If the comments section was a fair indicator, people did not believe Megacorp was entitled to a great deal of sympathy for being criticized for their bad corporate behavior. Watching the train wreck of an interview, Benjamin couldn't help but conclude the company was throwing fuel on the fire. And then, the next day, he learned it was part of a strategy, no matter how ill-conceived, to try to telegraph to the public that Megacorp would get the last word. The company had filed a temporary injunction filled with debatable conclusions, outright demonstrable falsehoods, and an embarrassing number of typos, but the judge, not having the countervailing facts, had signed off on it. In addition to attempting to pressure Benjamin and Chris to remove their videos, it threatened to tie up the very funds they needed to mount their defense. Worse, it implied that Benjamin and Chris were responsible for a number of crimes, none of which they'd participated in, but which Megacorp contended they were responsible for because they'd told their side of the story truthfully, and that had led others to harass Megacorp employees. As the story had been exploding, Benjamin had tried to remember not to get his hopes up. But the human brain, evolved for living in communities of 30 to 60 hunter-gatherers in the Serengeti, was not capable of comprehending millions of people simultaneously watching a video online. Benjamin had attended the New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square twice in his life, so he had a rough conception of what a million people looked like. But he couldn't truly conceive of millions of viewers as anything more than a number, a counter ticking up, as abstract as a digital clock's description of time. He could feel sympathy for Megacorp. They were human and similarly subject to the limits of the brain, so they thought of their critics as a monolith, the angry public, and blamed the few individuals they could name for all the flack they were receiving for having their own choices come to light. But the additional accusations, in conjunction with the demands for huge financial penalties Benjamin and Chris would have to pay Megacorp, drove him back to the same despair he'd felt the week before. Almost. The support of so many people online had heartened him, and their financial commitments, no matter how small, showed they were literally invested in Benjamin and Chris's struggle for justice. Their concern would not simply vanish because Megacorp was now attempting to silence them. Plus, Benjamin reminded himself, he was a writer. So often that felt like a mixed blessing. Yes, he could write novels people enjoyed, but his compulsion to put pen to paper, not literally, as his handwriting couldn't keep up with his composition and was well-nigh illegible even when he wrote more slowly, resulted in book after book, but nothing close to a profitable writing career. A more clever and less scrupulous person would surely have found a more remunerative use of their time, like starting a company that licensed franchises to do all the labor for them, then taking those businesses back to resell them without incurring any cost, a brilliant profit-generating strategy if you could bully people with legal threats and overwhelm the small business owners with technical quibbles, making most go away empty-handed without fighting back. That was a much better business model than writing books, especially if one had the kind of constitution which allowed them to constantly rewrite the story in their own mind, to convince themselves they were doing the right thing no matter who they hurt, and to feel like an aggrieved victim when called out for that harm. If only Benjamin could have employed his writing powers in that way, a kind of narcissistic mental editing rather than the harder work of crafting a complete novel for others. With such a power, perhaps he would have been able to saunter through the world, stepping on people and shouting at them for daring to say ouch. Instead, he lay awake, worried about any harm he may have caused, regretting every minor embarrassment for decades after the other person had forgotten it, obsessing over interactions before they even took place to try to make sure he wouldn't offend, would be liked, would achieve the kind of external validation he so pathetically required. But these compulsions, both to acquire some ephemeral kudos from strangers and to write stories to entertain himself and others, had combined to motivate him to develop, as Liam Neeson's character in Taken said, a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you. Benjamin would never be physically intimidating, as he was so obviously congenitally opposed to and ill-suited for any kind of physical violence, and his fear of offending made him unobjectionable even in most rhetorical situations. But when he felt he was defending someone else from injustice, he could tell a damn good story about wizards or vampires or kaiju-sized eldritch monsters, which were really stories about other things entirely. So this week he refused to curl up in a fetal ball and long for tears that would not come. Instead, he got his ass to work. He remembered this exact strategy had strained his marriage to the breaking point when he was in Spain. Work could be an unhealthy place to hide, but it could also be a means to fight back. Over the next 24 hours, Benjamin couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He could only type in a fever. And this aggression, in addition to manifesting as an abusive attack on his keyboard, which did not deserve to have its keys depressed so viciously, also translated into a kind of buzzing energy, motivating Rolando as well. Blocks away, in the much nicer condo the old knight had rented, he set about researching the discovery in the graveyard. By day, he'd make phone calls and send encrypted emails to contacts around the world, gathering information about what the restless spirits might portend. And late at night, he'd take Serge with him to cemeteries that were further and further afield, pardon the pun, from Portland, performing his searching spell in each one and discovering they, like the Multnomah Park Cemetery, were chock full of restless spirits. The few graves that held the coffins of people who'd truly passed on to whatever undiscovered country lay beyond this universe seemed to belong to the very young, as identified by their gravestones. This told Rolando a lot, though he admitted some of his conclusions were more speculative than others. For one thing, he took this to mean that the effects of the curse on the United States were not intrinsic to its soil. Those infants or young children who died found peace beyond the grave, or whatever came next, since even with his magical ability and contacts in the magical world, Rolando had never discovered or heard a convincing account of what truly happened to a person after death. Yet these children had, presumably, been born in the United States. And they were buried in it. It was difficult to see a clear pattern with only gravestones to work with. Death between the ages of 10 and 20 was so rare, he would have been making an assumption based on a few scant graves of teens who may have been at rest or lit up as restless spirits, identified by his searching spell. While he couldn't make a definitive judgment about how long it took for the curse to take effect, it seemed clear it was firmly in place by adulthood. Similarly, it affected adults whose gravestones identified them as immigrants to the United States, as well as those who, presumably, were born in the country. Rolando felt this was a valuable clue into the way the curse worked. "Why do you think that?" Serge asked him. They were standing in a cemetery hours from Portland, on a plot of land far more expansive than the little cemetery set amidst a frenetic urban setting. This one sat on a hill near only one road, a major highway where cars still zipped by in the middle of the night, their headlights appearing around one distant bend, illuminating the valley below and then twisting away into darkness. The cemetery stood above this road on a hilltop, and it bore the uncreative name Hilltop Cemetery. Just like in the Multnomah Park Cemetery, when Rolando had cast his spell in the center of the field, they'd watched the glow ripple out, illuminating almost every grave on the hillside as the source of a spirit that could be called up and employed as a familiar. Serge and Rolando then searched the graves, taking note of the ones which were not illuminated and trying to piece together some meaning from the absences. Rolando carried his sword cane, with the skull of Poe affixed to the handle, holding the raven's skull aloft, magically illuminated, to help them read the gravestones without creating light a person opposed to seeing magic could identify. He continued his explanation. "The curse must be geographic in nature, but it is an effect which grows over time. I suspect the caster generates it continuously in some way, and it affects everyone here like a poison, building up over years. I also suspect that even if we can find this caster and interrupt the spell, the effects will linger like a poison leaving the body, unless we can find some more dramatic magical antidote. Serge frowned at this. But maybe the spell was only cast once, hundreds of years ago, and it's like they polluted the whole country with bad magic and they're not even around anymore. I've been reading about spells that can have effects that last even after the caster stops concentrating on them. Permanent conditions. He held his own sword casually in his right hand. Though sheathed, he didn't use Baganawatig as a cane. He'd magically affixed the skull of Koman to the end of the pommel. Larger and wider than the skull of Poe, it allowed Serge to hold the handle with barely any force, the weight of the larger, heavier sword almost entirely supported by the molars of the red panda skull, biting gently into the part of the side of Serge's hand between his thumb and index finger, the heavy blade gently swinging like a pendulum as he walked. What makes you think this curse, whatever it is, has to be replenished? This is a fair question, Sir Sanchez, Rolando said. You are correct that some spells leave effects which can linger for centuries. But I have acquired information from some of my contacts which bolsters my theory that the spell is being maintained. We see these illuminated graves here in Oregon. I contacted a knight-errant who is adventuring in Alaska, and they spent an evening checking a local graveyard there. Sure enough, the spirits were not at rest. But I reached out to another knight in the Philippines, and she checked a graveyard there for us. She reported back that nothing was amiss. Like all the graveyards I've been to in Spain, almost all the souls were at rest. I don't get it, Serge said. First, we know the spell must have been cast quite some time ago. There is a grave in this very cemetery, which is the resting place of a woman who lived from 1799 to 1901, and her spirit is not at rest. So this spell must have its origin before 1901 at least. If the spell was something that could be cast once and for all, and it was cast before 1959, it would presumably not have included Alaska, because that was not part of the United States yet. But it would have included the Philippines, which was a U.S. territory until 1946. Serge nodded. Good detective work. You know my country's history better than I do. Perhaps. You will find many people in the world know U.S. history better than you Americans, and this should not be a huge surprise. People who are subject to the aggression of an empire must learn to navigate its whims, its potential harms and blessings, with much greater care than those who can live more safely in its embrace. That's why the Americans who know its history best are the most marginalized people. They don't have the luxury to be unaware. You, for example, must be hyper-aware of the history of police violence against people with your skin color. But you don't really need to know when Alaska became a state to navigate your daily life. Everyone in the world can be helped or harmed by American foreign and domestic policy. It's good to know what to expect. He shrugged. Also, I was born in 1886, so I've witnessed a lot more of your country's history than you have. Serge chuckled as they passed to the next gravestone. Yes, that is a bit of an unfair advantage. Just then, the smell hit them. Poe, standing on Rolando's shoulder, flapped its ebony wings furiously until ghostly glowing feathers fell out, dissolving into dust in the air. Serge's new familiar, Koman, who'd been trotting along next to him as fast as a red panda can trot, its bouncing little gallop matching his slower saunter, suddenly stood up on its hind legs and threw its paws in the air in alarm. Serge scanned the graveyard, recognizing the terrible smell, an acrid urine odor, like a porta-potty at a busy construction site on a hot day, only magnified 100-fold. Rolando wrinkled his nose, but he was intrigued, not by the horrid stench, but by what it might signify. Like Serge, he looked amongst the headstones, and after a moment he found the glowing creature. It looked just like the one in the used car lot outside the Multnomah Park Cemetery, but this one was within the graveyard itself, crawling up the side of a marble tombstone, its 4 sets of pincers clicking together as it slid on its slug-like single foot beneath the segmented shells on its back. As Rolando noticed it, the Don Juantuno stopped, only the wavering ridge around its foot continuing to wriggle, and then it turned its head in his direction, its single, eerily human eye inside its ring of mandibles, rolling around to find him, then fixing on his location, the arrhythmic clicking speeding up and increasing in volume. "So strange," Rolando mumbled. "2 of them in 2 graveyards. It could be coincidence, I suppose, but—" Serge approached, staring at the 5-inch-long, glowing, revolting magical creature. The Don Juantuno's eye flicked back and forth between both men, took in their red panda and raven familiars, and then fixed its eye on Rolando once again. "Dude," Serge said, not as a reference to anyone, but as an expletive. He rarely used the word, but it found its way into his vocabulary when he felt overwhelmed with disgust. That's fucking gross. We should get out of here. Yes, I agree, Rolando said. But Serge noticed a slight crease of concentration winking in and out of existence between the older knight's eyes. What? Serge asked as they walked off toward the clearer air. Oh, it is nothing, I think. Probably nothing. Just coincidence, but strange. Then Serge had a moment of insight. He reached into the large pocket of his coat, not an interior pocket like the ones in Rolando's magical coat of holding, but an oversized glove pocket in his Cleveland Guardians jacket, and he pulled out the notebook he'd been turning into his grimoire. Rolando had advised him to memorize the spell for creating a source of illumination first, and now he understood why that was necessary. Without that one, he wouldn't be able to read the other spells in the dark. He gripped the sword more tightly, held it upside down, and whispered the strange words from memory, directing his voice at the skull. Gorman, his familiar, infused the words with more magic than Serge could have mustered on his own, but the skull-less red panda, the rest of its skeleton slightly visible through its semi-transparent ghost flesh, didn't have to assist much on this, one of the easiest spells. The skull on his sword's hilt lit up with a similar glow to Rolando's, allowing him to read the words he'd copied into his book. As Serge flipped through the pages, Rolando turned back to him, and with an unusual degree of impatience for such a calm person, grumbled, "Perhaps you can do that back at the car, out of the stink, Sir Sanchez?" Serge found the spell he wanted. He hadn't practiced it much, but he hoped his pronunciation key would be clear enough to make it work. Reading the key toward Gorman's skull, he couldn't feel any immediate effect, and expected to make a fool of himself. But he tested it. "Hey," he said to the Don Juan, "who sent you here?" The response was more of the unusual clicks, but Serge heard a human voice clearly overlaid on the top of the sound, like an audio transmission mic'd into an earpiece, but in his mind. "I cannot tell you that, human. And besides, you'd really rather not worry about it, right?" Rolando blinked, then raised his cane and spoke the same spell, so he caught the next exchange. "What is your name, Don Juan?" Serge said. "I am not foolish enough to give you my name, Sir Knight. What do you take me for, a duende? And you don't need one more thing to remember. There's just too much going on to try to keep track of it all, right? It's all so overwhelming and depressing." This argument felt persuasive. Serge hadn't been paying attention to the news lately for exactly that reason. Just the day before, the Department of Justice had announced the investigation into one of the president's many sexual assault victims, not even pretending to challenge his guilt for the underlying crime, just harassing her for something frivolous they knew they wouldn't win to exact a small measure of revenge. Even more galling, it was reported they were weighing making a motion to the Supreme Court that the president shouldn't have to pay the damages to his victim for his defamation on the grounds he'd been slandering her in his official capacity as president, and was therefore immune, as though defaming his own rape victim was something he was doing on behalf of the nation. On the same day, Republican primary voters in Texas chose as their nominee for Senate a guy who'd been indicted on felony charges multiple times, reported to the FBI by 8 members of his own staff, impeached from the Texas State House for bribery, obstruction of justice, and disregard of official duty, and was even once caught on video stealing a $1,000 pen from a colleague in court. And on the international front, the U.S. announced it had reached a ceasefire agreement with Iran, which might, at best, leave the U.S. poorer and weaker than before the war began, with no clear benefit to anyone involved. In the midst of such a stench, Serge considered wandering away from learning anything else. And yet... What about this cemetery do you want me to notice? What should I be paying attention to here? Notice the tombstones, and the night sky above us. Look at all those stars. The Don Juan pointed up with its pincers, stopping the clicking momentarily, but its eye remained set on Serge, and it resumed its staccato buzzing. "Yes, look up. Do you see the Big Dipper there? Such a clear night tonight, isn't it?" Serge turned to Rolando. "He doesn't want us to look at..." And then he saw Rolando standing stock still, staring up at the sky, his mouth slightly agape, his cane held so loosely it would slip from his grip any moment. "Rolando?" he asked. "It is such a clear night, isn't it?" the old knight said. His voice sounded fuzzy, drunken. "But it smells terrible. We should return to the car and go home. But maybe we could go up to the roof and look at the stars from there, yes?" "Oh, shit," Serge hissed. Holding the glowing hilt of his sword near his book, he flipped to another new spell. He'd never tried it before and couldn't remember hearing Rolando guide him through the pronunciation, though he had, as evidenced by Serge's written pronunciation key below it. Serge desperately hoped he could say these words correctly. He read them out to Koman's skull, and again, his red panda familiar held up its arms in its instinctive gesture of menace. It worked just as Serge had hoped when he'd chosen the species to house Koman Soanarat's power. The power, well, it surged. The skull on Serge's sword blinked even more brightly for a moment, and a beam of Koman's ochre-hued light spread into a widening cone, encompassing the older knight. Rolando blinked. "Que demonios?" "Rolando?" Serge asked gently. "You back? I tried Cure Curse, and—"
"Yes, this seems to have worked. This was well done, Sir Sanchez."
Then he looked at the Don Juan. His thumb rotated to the head of his cane in a practiced motion, and he pulled Makawatabide from its scabbard.
"Now let us enter into glorious battle with this little monstrosity. Prepare yourself to be dispatched most painfully, creature."
The Don Juan couldn't move quickly, but it tilted itself up, its segmented back arching like a centipede's, its slimy, wriggling single foot waving its odious secretions as its only defense. "Wait," it said in its clicking, and both warrior mages heard the translation in their minds. "I'll tell you whatever you want to know." "I don't believe you," Serge said, drawing Baganawatig. The magical blade crackled with blue lightning. "You'll try to tell us anything but what you don't want us to know. It's kind of in your name." Rolando whispered some words to the skull of Poe, now upside down because he held the sword straight up. The skull flashed, and he said,
"What is your name, creature?"
"Tushroob," it said. Rolando looked at Serge.
"Ah, it can tell the truth."
Then he pointed Makanawanabide's thin, unbreakable blade at the creature like a fencer.
"Tushroob, who commanded you to do your work here in the cemetery?"
"It was a wizard named Fenkam. Creepy guy. Wore a monocle." "What kind of shoes did he wear?" Serge asked. The Don Juan rolled its eye, stared up through its ring of pincers, then spoke. "I think they were New Balance. Yes, New Balance." "Was that true?" Serge asked Rolando. The old knight nodded definitively. "Comfortable middle-aged white guy shoes. That's our guy. Fenkam, eh? What order did he give you?" "To make sure no one would notice the restless dead." Rolando lowered his sword.
"And how long have you been here?"
The Don Juan pincers clicked, but Rolando and Serge didn't hear an immediate translation, then realized this was the creature's version of counting on its fingers. 57 years, it said. "Holy shit," Serge breathed. "Just here in this cemetery for 57 years?" "I had no choice," Tushroob said. "And it's not that bad. I love this valley. It's a beautiful place." "Well, sure, but to be stuck here for 57 years? He resheathed Baganawatig and looked at Rolando. "I feel bad for the thing now."
"I'm less convinced," Rolando said. "You are not the one who was cursed by it. Tell me, creature, where is this Fenkam now?"
"I have no idea, I swear. He captured me 57 years ago in Delaware. He could be anywhere now."
Rolando nodded sadly. "This is the truth." He lowered Makawatabide. "Well, we have a name for the wizard who abducted the Anhanas, at least. We can research his whereabouts, ask around. I have contacts who might know him."
"Yeah, but can we do that work far away from Tushroob, please?" Serge turned to the Don Juan. "No offense." "None taken," it clicked. "And should we set it free somehow?" Serge asked Rolando. Rolando, his sword returned to its cane form, aimed the skull at Don Juan.
"Where would you go if you were set free, creature?"
"Oh, I know," it clicked excitedly. "There are mountains to the west of here. I've been looking at them for 57 years. I would go there, far away from grieving humans. I am so sick of humans." Its single eye flicked to Serge. "No offense."
"Yes, we will set it free,"
Rolando said, expressing all the eagerness of someone reminded they needed to mow the lawn or take the trash out to the curb.
"Then we get to work finding this Fenkam."
"Tonight?"
"If he has the Anhanas in captivity and is somehow involved in the curse upon this nation, I see no reason to wait."
Rolando couldn't have guessed how right he was. At that very instant, in a cave in western Wyoming, just inside Badlands National Park, the wizard Fenkam approached the 3 magical bird cages holding the Anhanas he'd captured, Rihanna, Joanna, and Lana. The sounds of the swinemen echoed from near the cave's mouth, where they stood guard. Well, they didn't stand much. As the sounds attested, they slept there, snoring loudly, ate chips, bags and all, and made one another snort laugh by ripping the loudest, wettest farts they could squeeze out. Fenkam addressed the three magical creatures in their cages. "I know, they're revolting, but they serve their purpose, just like the three of you." For more than 20 years, Benjamin had lectured creative writing students not to create mustache-twirling villains wearing monocles, tapping the tips of their fingers together and cackling like maniacs. Real people aren't like that, he'd told his students. Even the people doing the greatest evil believe they're doing the right thing, or feel they're being compelled to do the wrong things for the right reasons. Always try to write villains who have believable motivations and think they are the heroes. They make for far more compelling characters and create more interesting conflicts with your protagonists, who should also be imperfect. The reader should have to decide who to side with, not be told by the character's cartoonish evil. And yet, in a world of Elon Musks and Donald Trumps and Dennis Millers and Ted Cruzes, of corporations behaving as though they truly were beholden only to the law they could purchase, not to any deeper sense of justice available to everyone, Benjamin had to acknowledge cartoonish villains were also inspired by reality, albeit a poorly written reality. And let's be honest, Benjamin was in no position to criticize anyone for looking like a villain. With his bald head, extremely pale skin, generally unbecoming facial features, he was the first to admit he looked like a hybrid of the Chameleon from the Spider-Man comics and Gollum from Lord of the Rings. His beard may have hidden some of his face at one time, but the stress of the last year had caused it to go gray shockingly quickly, and the addition of 2 eyebrow rings with little black horns didn't help him look like he was on the side of the angels. But Fenkam fit the part in every way. Of all the remote places in America he'd considered, Fenkam had set up his underground lair in the Badlands specifically because of the name. He had to duck as he entered the large chamber because instead of a traditional wizard's hat, he wore a tall, pointy version of a clan hood, but in black, matching his black robe but clashing with his white and blue New Balance sneakers. He had bushy, thick eyebrows, one of which was permanently lower than the other, as he flexed the muscles on his forehead to hold his monocle in place. And he'd even grown a handlebar mustache, which he twirled around a finger as he sneered at the world. Benjamin wouldn't have chosen this particular affectation for any villain. His own uncle, now passed away, had sported a handlebar mustache, though his had ended in even larger round curls, and was set above a mouth prone to break into a generous grin when he wasn't making funny faces to amuse his nephews and nieces and children. Benjamin loved his mustachioed uncle dearly, and didn't want the look associated with someone who was consciously nefarious. But there Fenkam was, leaning into every evil cliché imaginable, sneering like someone who couldn't ever genuinely laugh except at someone else's expense, while he plotted to cover statues in gold and build himself a giant stupid ballroom. Fenkam's familiar slunk in behind him. A skullless skeleton, just like Poe and Coman, the gate would have given away the species even if it hadn't been revealed by the green glow where the ears, snout, and lolling tongue belonged. Fenkam had chosen to trap a human spirit in the body of a golden retriever puppy. When the familiar neared the wizard's heel, Fenkam kicked at it. Of course, his foot couldn't make contact with its body unless the ghostly form chose to be solid, but the wizard hoped to catch it unaware and hear a yelp of pain just to brighten his own day. Irritated his kick hadn't connected, Fenkam left off twirling his mustache and repositioned his monocle as he glared at the Anhanas. "I expect the swinemen will outlive the three of you. If anyone comes to your rescue, they'll get a big surprise. But even if they can defeat my swinemen, you will have served as bait and will no longer be useful. The time is drawing nigh. I've been working on this curse for 407 years now. I've been committed from the outset to drag this out as long as possible until it is absolutely impossible to fight. And we are only a few years from completion. Not even your goddess, Ariel Honan, will stand a chance when I complete my masterstroke." He clapped his hands together softly, then rubbed them back and forth over a grin that looked, frankly, pretty rapey. The Anhanas looked back and forth at one another in fear, and then Lana leaned forward and grabbed the bars of her cage, even though contact with them burned her hands. "But why?" she cried. "What do you have against them?" "Them? You mean against humans? Nothing in particular. I am a human, though I've perhaps risen above that designation in a number of ways. But all the other humans, I don't have any particular animus towards them, or any concern. Caring for humans is your business, little Anhanas, not mine. This isn't about them." Then he chuckled, not quite the full villain cackle, but an even more haunting, derisive laugh. "They're merely collateral damage in a struggle they will never know about and couldn't possibly comprehend. Then he flapped a hand, waving away 341 million residents of the United States and the billions more the country could destroy in its downfall. Joanna, a 6-inch figure made of liquid water, almost indistinguishable from her sisters, stepped toward the bars of her own cage, though she didn't touch them. Then why? For what purpose? For the only real reason to do anything of consequence, little Anhana. To win. To win at all costs. Joanna looked at her sisters. Rihanna hooked a thumb at their captor. She spoke to her sisters, but she aimed her raised voice at Fenkam. Don't bother. There's no reasoning with him. He pretends to be rational, but he has no interest in negotiating, because he sees everything as a game. When it comes down to it, he's completely insane. Fenkam smiled. Perhaps. If there is some kind of existential purpose other than winning, I don't know what it is. Maybe that makes me crazy. But look at the three of you. Why do you care about the humans you select? Ultimately, it's arbitrary. You just love them. He placed his fingertips on his chest. I love myself. Self-care, I think they call it. Or narcissism, I don't care which. That's the great thing about my ideology, little Anhanas. It's impenetrable. It's just an added bonus that people who are beneath me find it so confounding. It really makes perfect sense. They're just too confused by their concern for all these... He waggled his hand again, this time below his waist, like he was telepathically sweeping the cave's floor. Competing interests. My interest is singular, and I'm honest about it. I care about winning. Joanna motioned to the walls around them. How is this winning? You live in a cave with a bunch of swinemen. Everyone hates you. At that, he snapped. He held up his wand with the puppy skull affixed to the top and spoke some words. 3 small balls of fire appeared in his free hand. They levitated there for a moment, then rose and rotated around Fenkam's body at chest height, first slowly, then faster and faster until they formed an almost indistinguishable ring before launching out individually at the cages. The Anhanas screamed when the balls of fire hit the bars of their cages, burst, and coated them with flames. If they'd lacked the magical ability to heal themselves, they would have been completely immolated. Instead, they writhed in agony on the floors of their cages as the flames boiled their water away, and they reconstituted themselves slowly. See? Fenkam shouted over their screams. Don't you see? I am the victim in all of this. You 3 hate me. Everyone hates me. I hurt them, and then they blame me, and then I hurt them some more, and the only way to end is to silence them so I cannot be blamed. That's the ultimate win. Your silence. The silence of anyone who blames me for the things I've done to them. Then no one will be able to be unfair to me ever again. He calmed with eerie speed. The egg will hatch soon, and I will perform the greatest act of magic this world, this whole universe, has ever seen. And then everyone will love me, or be destroyed. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube, or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. I like to give shout-outs to fellow creators, so if you're a Patreon patron or a Substack member and you have a book or some other project for me to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com, and I'll mention it here on the show. See you back here next week for Chapter 21 of Tilting at Windmills. Teaser: Rolando and Serge will need help before they can confront Fenkam, and that will come from a surprising direction.